Britain has a rich and diverse landscape, ceaselessly changing with the seasons and the lives of its people. It has provided inspiration to artists for centuries. Painting the landscape is a familiar occupation. The artist carries his paints, brushes and easel out into the countryside and faithfully renders the view he sees before him. But even when a painter sets out with just such an intention, the reality is more complex. Every painter brings their own unique vision to the canvas. The time in which they live, the political, social and economic circumstances of the age, and their own personal situation will all manifest themselves in the final picture. Landscape painting is a discipline in which British artists are acknowledged to have created some of the greatest work made anywhere in the world. But it was not born here. We imported, borrowed, and learned how to paint the landscape. In the process, we recorded the history of our country and its people, the value placed on its land, and the aesthetic and cultural worth of our vision of ourselves. Until the 1600s, the British landscape was all but ignored by painters, and British painters were all but ignored by those with the money to commission art. The break with Rome under Henry VIII cut Britain off from the cultural life of the continent and the patronage of the Church, which did so much to sustain the arts in Catholic Europe. Even our royal portraits were painted by foreigners. Hans Holbein, who painted this portrait of Henry, was German, and though his work tells us so much about Tudor Britain, he had no interest in our landscape.
I guess it's one of the ironies of a genre of art which is thought of as being so distinctly British that you have to look beyond Britain for the origins of British landscape painting. And it derives from Flemish art and Dutch art of an earlier period.
The first British monarch to show a serious concern for the artistic health of his nation was Charles I, and as if to make up for a previous deficiency, it became an obsession for him. Charles greatly admired the work of Flemish painters like Peter Paul Rubens, and was delighted when, in 1629, Rubens arrived in London. But his motives were not artistic. This was a complex period in European politics, but if you need directions, ask a historian.
Rubens comes to London not as an artist, but as a diplomat. He's working for the Spanish crown, and he's come to enlist the help of one of the more important Protestant kings of Europe, King Charles, to bring peace to Europe.
Rubens painted this allegorical picture during his negotiations, portraying Charles as St. George.
Charles wanted to sit for a portrait by Rubens, but given that technically England and Spain were still at war, that would have just been completely unacceptable, so he had to make do with this. What you see here is a bucolic vision of harmony, and this is why it's not just an allegory, it's actually a landscape painting. It's such a fascinating landscape painting, because Rubens comes to England as an ambassador, and he is very struck. He writes home, he writes off to Spain, saying this is a land of extreme beauty and peace. There hasn't been any fighting inside Britain for centuries. It's full of art lovers, antiquarians, collectors. King Charles himself first among them, the greatest lover of art who's ever sat on the throne of England. He portrays the king in a noble guise, and divine providence is smiling on his land. The heavens are beaming down. You can see here what looks like Lambeth Palace, perhaps Westminster Abbey, Palace of Whitehall, Banqueting House. It really is a collage.
Oh yes, it is a collage. It's a fantasy, I tell you. It's not in any way a realistic painting. There's some buildings here, and I'd like to put them here. It's like They're buildings along the Thames, actually, and this is somewhere around Aldgate or Islington or somewhere like that. It's a beautiful landscape in the background there. And there's a Thames-like river running through it, which accentuates the depth in the picture. And yet, I can't help feeling somehow, looking at this painting, the more I looked at it, I kept wondering what made this painting appear so phony to me. It's all flattery. He's being a diplomat. He's sucking up to people and making them feel good about themselves. The difference between Rubens and me is a two-faced son of a bitch, actually. What I think Rubens did was to flatter Charles I. He wouldn't be doing what Private Eye were doing in the 60s, you know, what I was doing then in the 60s. What I'm trying to do is insult him.
Today we'd really think about this as a political cartoon. As WikiLeaks has demonstrated, diplomats are rather candid in their reports back home. And indeed, Rubens makes all sorts of judgments about Charles that are absolutely fascinating to the historian. The great tragedy of this painting is it's a vision that never came to pass. And in fact, it contributed really to Charles's downfall. Charles made peace with Spain, but in doing so, he won the undying enmity of the vast majority of his subjects. The Englishman did not want this harmonious vision of a united Europe.
No, clever bloke. I still don't really like him.
Rubens's trip to Britain marked a turning point in his career. At the age of 53, he gave up diplomacy and retired to the country. Rather less conventionally, he got married to a 16-year-old model. But despite Britain's Eurosceptic outlook, Rubens had spotted one important fact. This was a beautiful country. That simple truth was the foundation for all that was to follow. Charles, meanwhile, continued to focus rather more on art than on his increasingly resentful subjects, and soon found a replacement for Rubens. Anthony van Dyck, who'd been Rubens's assistant, arrived in London in 1632 to take up the position of principal painter in ordinary to their majesties. In an early royal commission, Van Dyck depicts Charles's nephew, Prince Rupert. Through the arch behind him is a very English-looking hillside, suggesting that Van Dyck had done a bit of research.
Maybe he was sketching for his own pleasure, but because we know that this tree appears in the background of one of his paintings, the portrait of Prince Rupert, it could also be that from the beginning he already envisaged to build up a sort of repertoire to use in his future paintings.
Van Dyck's pictures of his royal master were just what Charles was after, reinforcing the divine right of kings in oil paint. But however accomplished Van Dyck was at painting the landscape, it was still just a backdrop. His evident pleasure in depicting the countryside was something he could only do in a drawing.
The reason why I love drawings so much is because they offer you a glimpse into the thoughts of an artist. It's a sort of signature, you're eye to eye to what the artist saw and how he perceived the world around him.
While Van Dyck's opportunities to paint the landscape were scarce, those of his British contemporaries were almost non-existent. With the exception of vanity pictures of the estates and country mansions of the nobility, the British showed no interest in paintings of their landscape. But there were landscapes hanging on the walls inside these houses. At the same time that Van Dyck was sketching the countryside around London, a Frenchman was making a name for himself painting the Roman Campagna, the countryside around Rome.
Right, here we are in the landscape room. These paintings were bought by the builder of the house, Thomas Cook, on his grand tour in Italy. He had the longest recorded grand tour in history. It was 6 years. The most important painter here is Claude Lorraine. The paintings are these wonderful sort of classical landscapes.
At the time, these paintings wouldn't have been thought of as landscapes. Instead, they were mythical representations of stories from classical antiquity. For example, this is a Greek mythological scene, Argus guarding Io. Such stories gave a sense of moral seriousness that a simple view of an Italian hillside would not have displayed. As long as everyone went along with this premise, Claude could continue to paint the countryside. He was under no illusions about this ruse himself. "I sell the landscape," he said. "The figures are gratis."
Holkham is quite unique, actually, in the fact that it is really the work of one man, the builder of the house, Thomas Cook. He and his friends, all of whom were very learned, they used to retire to the library and read the great classics, and they would read them in ancient Latin or ancient Greek. So they all understood the symbolism of various paintings in here, and then you could then look out the window and you could see the English landscape that he had moulded in an Italianate style.
Magnificent as the setting of Holkham Hall is, the idea that you might fashion a little bit of Italy from the raw materials of England was most perfectly realized in a valley in Wiltshire. This is Stourhead, created by wealthy banker Henry Hoare after his visit to Italy. His inspiration for this manufactured landscape was another myth and another painting by Claude.
This is one of Claude's most famous paintings in the National Gallery in London. This is Aeneas at Delos. In the left foreground, we've got a bridge, and then here is a view of a Pantheon-type building, as we see over across the lake. This image is often cited by art historians as being an obvious precursor for what Henry Hoare was trying to achieve here in 3 dimensions, not on a canvas.
Claude's landscapes came from his imagination, but his art had a powerful effect on men like Henry Hoare. The immense undertaking involved in creating a real landscape based on a painting underlined the lengths to which a wealthy man could go to live in Arcadia. Stourhead was an extraordinary achievement, creating a landscape that was to inspire artists for centuries and opening the door for Capability Brown and the landscape garden movement that followed. In displaying their learning in this way, the British upper classes saw themselves as embodying all the virtues of the antique past. Adopting the cultural and political trappings of the Roman Empire, proclaimed the noble ideals of what was to become the British Empire.
These young men were inculcated in the classics at English public school, and when they leave they go on a grand tour, which is a kind of finishing school where they take their copies of their Virgil and their Cicero and their Ovid with them as a kind of portable guidebook to Italy.
Grand tours were also an opportunity to do a bit of shopping for art to hang on the walls back home. And the young British milords were legendary shopaholics, buying up anything with an Italian name, however indifferent the quality. So where did this leave the aspiring homegrown talent?
The artists had a more fragmented, opportunistic relationship with classical culture. Basically, It was incredibly difficult for some of them to even get to Italy. We know some of them were patronised by wealthy British aristocrats who actually pay for them to go. But often we know that it's much more of a social and economic struggle for them to get by.
This landscape was painted by a British painter, George Lambert. He certainly knew what was required. All the elements that made Claude so successful are here. The soft Italian light and the classical ruins. George, though, never made it to Italy. Lambert was not alone in his growing frustration with the status of British artists in their home market. Along with his great friend William Hogarth, he resented the preference for foreign painters and continental landscapes. In 1733, he painted this view of Box Hill in Surrey. It may be the first time a British artist painted a British landscape for its own sake. It was not just the background to a portrait. It showed no country mansion or estate. It was an accurate representation of a real place, and it still looks pretty much the same today. In the foreground of Lambert's painting, some farm labourers are harvesting the corn. But today, in the same valley, they're harvesting grapes. In much the same way that English wine is still seen as something of a novelty in its home market, Hogarth and Lambert struggled in a British art market that still had a palate attuned to continental tastes. Richard Wilson, a well-connected Welshman, painted this view of Westminster Bridge under construction in 1744. The undoubted disadvantage of being Welsh and not Italian was brought home to him when Canaletto moved to London and painted the same scene. Wilson decided to make the journey in reverse and moved to Italy. Once in Rome, he began turning out Arcadian landscapes with all the hallmarks of a Claude. His relocation did the trick, and he became hugely popular with the same British aristocrats who had ignored him at home. After 7 years, Wilson returned to Britain, but he never quite got Italy out of his system, which was very evident in the pictures he made.
I think Richard Wilson is being very clever, actually. I think he learnt a great deal when he was in Rome and took what he learnt about the classical idealisation of the landscape back to appeal to the British passion at the time for all things Italian. He's looking at the British landscape, but with that kind of Italian filter. This looks like as close as I'm going to get to perhaps where Richard Wilson would have painted this view from. Incredibly, actually, it's quite similar. I can recognise lots of the main motifs. There's the Holt Bridge, there's the hills in the distance. From this point, you can't actually see the church. And also, he seems to have exaggerated quite a lot for artistic purposes the rocky escarpment on the right-hand side. Interestingly, whereas Claude, I feel, has this kind of serenity about the sky, it feels like it's going to last forever. This is kind of slightly wild. It does have a real kind of British feel about it. The sky is incredibly similar. You've got this grey clouds all around, and here the grey clouds are enveloping the picture. There's just this little glimpse of this moment, this magical moment where you've got this light coming through and shining down on these three people. I've always been interested in Claude paintings, and I've recreated a number myself. I wanted to photograph the landscape around Britain today, but elevating it to the status of a Claudian, Arcadian vision. And that's exactly what Richard Wilson is doing. He's transposing Claude's ideals, but then he's making it with a landscape that people would recognise. I'm going to take some photographs now myself to try and construct my own view of the Holt Bridge and the surrounding area from the reality that I see here, but using my own artistic licence to capture what Wilson has captured here. We have to remember the landscape we see. It's always filtered, it's always a construction, and it's always been managed. And so that's quite interesting that now when you come back and you try and look at a landscape painting in the same spot, it's changed so much because the landscape has been managed in a different way. And now we're seeing that, in fact, there are more trees than there were 300, 400 years ago, which is actually really interesting because you wouldn't expect that.
How the landscape was managed was a thorny issue throughout the 18th century, and this controversy was reflected in the way it appeared in paintings. The portrayal of Britain as a new Rome never lost its appeal to the aristocracy, but as the century progressed, art became affordable to less elevated members of society, who didn't care for fashionable foreign names, and in any case preferred to see the land in which they lived presented in a more familiar guise. Britain was surely best painted by British artists, who naturally grew up loving it themselves, and we begin to recognise that our landscape was too beautiful to play a supporting role. In 1749, a 22-year-old artist from Sudbury in Suffolk painted this picture of a country neighbour and his new wife. Thomas Gainsborough's Mr. and Mrs. Robert Andrews was a thoroughly modern picture with a message. There's no pretense here. This is not Italy. We are unmistakably looking at a Suffolk landscape. Even the tree under which they are sitting is a native oak.
Well, what's wonderful about being here is that this tree is still growing. It's fantastic. It's now become one of these marvellous old veterans of which we've got a very large number in this country and which we ought to be very proud of. But I have to say that looking at this landscape, I'm rather amazed really, because I'd always thought that this was Gainsborough painting a real landscape, almost from the place where he'd put his easel, en plein air, so to speak. But it's actually all a bit different from that. I've just walked up that slope and it's much steeper than you might expect from the painting. And I think that what Mr. Andrews wanted to say was that here is a very up-to-date, newly enclosed farmed landscape. The old way of farming, the beasts wandered around and you couldn't develop a breed because really they shagged everything. But here you can breed to improve this strain of animals. And you can even see in the wheat field here that it's been drilled. The old way, you scattered seed broadcast like that. Now, with Jethro Tull's seed drill, you could sow it in lines. And that was much more efficient, made better use of the seed, you could hoe between it and so on and so forth. But it all looks to me very, very new. I think he's only just done it. And I think that this is the point of the landscape. I think that he's wanting to show off his new agricultural technology.
I farmed in Bulmer for 35 years on the land that adjoins Andrews, and as a young man I aspired to apply the same sort of inquiring, investigative, scientific approach that he was taking. One reason for me that the painting is so important is that it shows British agriculture at the time to be at the forefront of world farming. And Tolstoy in War and Peace refers to Count Nikolai being interested in English farming because English farming at the time was the best.
Well, this in 1750 is really the start of our modern idea of the countryside. It's somewhere that people go to enjoy leisure, really. It's a very, very modern idea because this is a lifestyle painting. And I could easily imagine this couple seated here today wearing Barber jackets and hunter wellies. He'd have a Purdy under his arm. She'd have her dogs, and this is a lifestyle that's still very desirable. You only have to look in the advertisement page of Country Life to see that this is the aspirational lifestyle today, just as much as it was in 1750. And I think even the way that he's standing, it seems to me he's a prosperous, comfortable chap. He's had a lot of good luck in life, I think, probably, and I could imagine him being in the Tory cabinet today.
Despite devoting over half of the picture to the Suffolk landscape, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews is still a portrait. In the classical league table of artistic value, a hierarchy handed down from the Italian Renaissance, landscape was an inferior subject for painters, coming just ahead of animals and bowls of fruit.
Landscape was really rather looked down upon. He saw landscape as somewhere where you went to relax, not just being in it, but also for himself, drawing it and painting it. It was almost his own secret pleasure that was done very much for himself.
What you see in the flicker and glitter and fluid excitement of his painted surfaces is an idea that this is real emotion which has been conveyed here. You are kind of buying into a vision of the landscape which is informed by a notion of sensibility, informed deeply by a notion of Gainsborough himself being an artist who, through his manipulation of paint, is embodying an emotional response to landscape and to nature.
From what we know about Gainsborough, he was something of a radical, but comes across as a very lovable and likeable figure. He clearly had a great sense of humour, and I think he'd be the sort of person that would welcome all ideas and interpretations and take them as he found them.
The radical ideas that excited Gainsborough were also having a profound effect on the landscape he painted. It wasn't just the Industrial Revolution that was gaining momentum. New farming methods were revolutionizing the countryside too. In 1778, Gainsborough painted this picture of his friend Thomas Cook of Holkham Hall, one of the greatest agricultural reformers of the day.
He made farming fashionable for the gentry, and he encouraged all his various farm tenants to improve their land. We had the Industrial Revolution happening around about the same time, and there was a very real need to feed the country. And agriculture, there was a need for a necessity for it to change, to get more efficient.
Despite his success as a portrait painter, Gainsborough wrote to a friend that he would like to retire to a sweet village and spend the fag end of life painting landscapes. When he died, the corridors of his house were piled high with these pictures, for which there was no market. Gainsborough may have had mixed feelings about painting his wealthy patrons, but portraiture gave him both financial security and artistic integrity. Another gifted landscapist, his near contemporary George Stubbs, was less fortunate. He was a sporting artist.
Stubbs' extraordinary achievement really is to elevate this lowly genre of sporting art into something which is so aesthetically distinguished. What we have is a vision of order and clarity which is meant to evoke classical painting.
Here is the Duke of Richmond admiring his racehorses being exercised on his estate at Goodwood. In much the same way that Gainsborough had been employed to show off Robert Andrews' modern farming techniques, Stubbs had been hired to show off the Duke's thoroughbreds. In both cases, of course, the landscape is the real star. Today, this same landscape is home to another kind of thoroughbred. More than any other factor, it has been the sporting enthusiasms of its various owners that has shaped the landscape of the Goodwood estate.
It's fascinating looking at the Stubbses and seeing how little the landscape has changed. I mean, that's exactly where the golf course is now, that Stubbs painting. That's where they were shooting then. I mean, shooting's played a major part in the British landscape. The fact there's been shooting here for 300 years, that's really preserved the landscape and the woodland and helped to develop it in a very, very positive way. It overlooks the sea, the cathedral's still there. I mean, it's changed very, very little. We've got horse racing in 1801, the cricket way back in 1727, and the motor racing in 1948. They've all just grown out of an enthusiasm to become part of the British summer. And in that sense, I think that they enhanced the landscape and they've become part of it in their own way. And we just want to make the most of it and preserve a truly beautiful piece of England.
Stubbs was not a man to do things by halves. In order to paint horses better than anyone else ever had, he rented a remote farmhouse in Lincolnshire and with the aid of Mrs. Stubbs spent 18 months cutting them up to see what they were made of.
£9 million. Any more? So, £9 million. Thank you very much.
Not bad for a sporting artist. Towards the end of his career, Stubbs painted a series of rural landscapes with agricultural workers going about their business. These figures are known as staffage.
Staffage is a lazy term used by art historians to describe the figures that will occupy landscape paintings. If you've got a portrait with people sitting in the landscape, that's not staffage. But if you have a landscape where various invented figures do things, they are staffage.
It's a challenge when we look at these paintings to say, well, either they are noble and they are elevating and they are creating this kind of heroism of everyday life, which is being presented to us here, or you say this is a dehumanizing vision of rural life from the perspective of the overseer or the landowner. And I'm not sure myself quite where Stubbs sits.
Stubbs' rural labourers appear to be contented, clean and well-dressed, just as the British ruling classes like to imagine them. But the dubious honesty of this portrayal became even more politicised in 1789, when matters took a dramatic turn in France.
When the French Revolution happens, of course, there's widespread panic because the British proletariat might pick up on some of the ideas that are being articulated across the Channel and behave in a similar way. Stubbs has offered an extraordinary vision of the agricultural scene because the corn isn't full of weeds or poppies. The labourers don't get dirty. They don't even break sweat. They've already got everything that the French are revolting for.
These labourers may have had other reasons to harbour dark thoughts of revolution. For some, the improvements in farming had come at a high price. Throughout the 18th century, the Enclosure Acts had changed the face of the British landscape. Ancient common lands, where grazing rights were shared, were enclosed, and absolute property rights were enforced by the landowners. The effect of these draconian changes were felt most keenly by the rural poor. A London painter called George Morland began to paint landscapes that told the stories of this new, dispossessed underclass. A rather less comfortable vision of society than that offered by Stubbs's happy labourers. Ferreting, the subject of this picture from 1792, was no simple country pastime. It could get you hung.
If they were quiet and they had a good dog, they could have filled the bucketfuls with rabbits. It wasn't just about the rabbits. Everything on this land belonged to the landowner, whether it be the berries, the mushrooms. It was a larder, and that was his larder. Even the twigs and the firewood, he owned everything. To him, taking a rabbit is the same as taking the berries and the mushrooms, the same as taking his family silver. It was his, and he didn't want anybody to take it.
A favourite subject for Morland was the country inn. We can feel sure these scenes are particularly accurate, as he spent so much of his own time drinking. Though he earned a fortune from engravings of his work, he spent it even faster.
Because he was painting to drink, he can be very, very sloppy, but he can also be quite risky. For example, and this is during the period of the French wars, he would show rustics drinking in pubs. This was thought to be a very bad idea, because if people get together in their own space, they might start communicating ideas.
I mean, Morland has been seen as a figure who takes into account aspects of rural life which officially were meant to be brushed under the carpet, poaching and ferreting, and the drinking and the disagreement and the potential for violence within the countryside, which maybe sometimes we can detect within his work.
The impact of political and social changes in the wider world was to have a profound effect on the development of landscape painting at home. The revolution in France made travel on the continent almost impossible and brought to an end the conveyor belt of art and ideas from Italy. The British grand tourist had nowhere to go. But artistically at least, things were improving on the home front. We could now confidently point to our own painters like Stubbs and Gainsborough as supremely accomplished. By offering training to young painters at the St. Martin's Lane Academy, Hogarth and Lambert had brought about the establishment in 1768 of the Royal Academy of Arts. Yet, despite this progress, in some quarters, attitudes to landscape art were ingrained. The discourses of the first president of the Academy, Sir Joshua Reynolds, rigidly promoted the classical artistic hierarchy that saw landscape painting as a lesser discipline. But the popularity of Morland's work had shown that people didn't pay much mind to that sort of talk. Britain was all set to enter a golden age of landscape art. At just this moment, a talented young Londoner completed his studies at the Royal Academy schools, only to discover that the origin of everything he had been taught was important about art was now inaccessible to him. Joseph Mallord William Turner, who was to take British landscape painting to its highest eminence, would have loved to have travelled to Italy, but instead he had to experience it at second hand. Having grown up a stone's throw from one aristocrat's recreation of an Italian scene, the Piazza at Covent Garden, he soon became inspired by another, the Gardens of Stourhead. Stourhead was by now the property of Richard Colt Hall, the grandson of its creator, Henry Hall.
This is an image by the young Turner when he was in his early 20s. And what we see here is not only the beginnings of Turner's painterly practice, but also the idea that the landscape that was inspired by 17th century painting is then becoming painted again in the late 18th century. You can see the temple there across the lake, and Turner, in painting this landscape, is very much putting himself within a tradition of artists that looks back to Claude. So we go from canvas to the landscape and then back onto canvas.
Richard Colt Hall had just managed to complete his grand tour before war with France made European travel impossible. A keen amateur artist himself, he gave Turner a drawing he had made of Lake Avernus near Naples and commissioned a painting from him to depict a classical myth from Virgil. The young Turner frequently imitated the style of other artists as a way of improving his own technique, and he painted this picture as a pastiche of the work of Richard Wilson. The lake represents the gateway to the underworld, a symbolic theme that reappears in the man-made landscape at Stourhead.
You feel here like you're coming underground into this sort of watery, cavernous world where you're encountering different creatures, like the sculpture of the river god at the entrance as you come in. Certainly this is such a shift away from the earlier 18th century, where the emphasis is on taming nature. This is allowing nature to confront us in her wildest form.
This new aesthetic ideal, which gained favour as we gained artistic confidence, was that of a picturesque beauty. And to trace its origins, we need to rewind a little. In 1761, Richard Wilson painted this view of a crumbling Roman arch with all his characteristic Italian touches. But not only was it once again not in Italy, it was not a ruin.
Until about 50 years ago, this was thought to be a view of an archway in the Borghese Gardens in Rome, until someone pointed out that it was in Kew Gardens, London, TW9.
This arch was the first example of a classical ruin newly built from scratch to satisfy a fashionable taste for decay.
In 1709, Sir John Vanbrugh was building Blenheim Palace, and he wrote a letter to the Duchess of Marlborough, his client, about this ruined manor house called Woodstock Manor. And in the letter, he says, can we preserve the manor? And it was the first time ever that anyone had tried to preserve a building. And he says, if you plant trees around it, it will look like the most attractive object that a landscape painter could invent. So with that letter, you get the beginning of a whole movement, the picturesque. The idea that you can compose a landscape like a framed picture, but you can walk into that picture. But also that idea of the imagination, of association, which can be about crashing rocks and waterfalls, all that stuff, but it can also be as simple as the idea that when you see smoke drifting up from, a clearing in the wood, you conjure up a pretty little cottage and a fireside.
Examples of fine picturesque views were conveniently available in Britain. And travelling to the remoter, more rugged parts of the kingdom to admire them filled the breach left by the loss of the classical Grand Tour. The habit of visiting these landscapes filtered down the social strata to a wider public, and guidebooks began to appear to direct the new tourists to the most agreeable views. The location that best exemplified the picturesque idea was the Wye Valley, and Tintern Abbey in particular. Turner painted Tintern in 1794, but he was a Johnny-come-lately. Its charms had first been widely proclaimed several years earlier by William Gilpin in his guidebook Observations on the River Wye and Several Parts of South Wales, etc., relative chiefly to picturesque beauty, made in the summer of the year 1770.
The beautiful landscape is rather monotonous. The picturesque landscape is rich and inviting, and you as the viewer are kind of invited on a journey through these various forms. So a ruin is picturesque, a completed shiny new church isn't. And there's that fetishization of the crumbling and the decaying and the ivy which is crawling over rubble. That's what the picturesque is about.
The pursuit of ever more dramatic light effects was another feature of picturesque landscapes. In this, Turner excelled. He was an avid recorder of sunrise and sunset, always looking for a sense of shock and awe in natural phenomena. In 1817, he produced this dramatic view of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. He still hadn't been to Italy himself, but so many other artists had painted the scene that he felt confident he could tackle it. A volcano erupting was the perfect example of a philosophical idea that went hand in hand with these picturesque landscapes, the concept of the sublime.
The sublime landscape overwhelms you. There's that possibility of threat, that indication of danger, of excitement. It's thrilling, it makes you feel very small. You find increasingly at public exhibitions and through printed reproductions pictures of avalanches, of volcanoes, of floods, of danger.
In the absence of British volcanoes to provide this magical combination of beauty and danger, painters discovered a similar visual feast closer to home in the furnaces of the Industrial Revolution. Coalbrook Dale by Night, by Philip de Luterberg, shows the Bedlam blast furnace smelting the local iron ore in a picture that could almost be the mouth of hell. The process continues today on a more modest scale, just up the valley from the original site at Blists Hill, Victorian town.
Ironwork in general, the danger side of it, has always been known that injuries would have occurred on a regular basis, burns, and you'd have to have been strong physically to get through this sort of trade. This picture obviously goes back to where iron first started, so this was all quite new, and people coming in and seeing the sky change colour would have been quite exciting to see what was going on. It looks a very, very nice picture, and I've actually got one of these on my house wall at home, in the hallway.
As with agriculture, industrialisation changed the landscape with alarming speed. Public admiration for technological progress and the prosperity it created was tempered by a concern for the loss of the rural way of life. In a remote Suffolk village, the young son of the local miller was painting the landscape in which he had grown up, showing no hint of this threat. John Constable, an almost exact contemporary of Turner, was to achieve an equally elevated status as a landscape painter.
There's a sort of mystery about why on earth John Constable wanted to be a painter, because there were, of course, no public galleries at the time when he formed this ambition. What he says about it is, these places made me a painter, and I suppose we have to believe that it was actually this landscape around East Bergholt which made him want to be a painter. The peak of Constable's achievement comes from 1819. You get a series of tremendously powerful landscapes. They were all painted out of perhaps 200 or 300 yards of towpath. 6 stonking, wonderful pictures, of which the Hay Wain is the best known. In general, it has changed remarkably little over the last 189 years. A few details have changed. Willie Lott's cottage over there has lost an outbuilding. The water's a little higher. The trees are different, but basically it's exactly the same place. And actually, the remarkable thing about this picture is the immense effort that Constable made to make it accurate.
But despite this fetish for accuracy, Constable was not averse to rearranging things if he needed to. As a rather mature student, at the age of 23 he attended the Royal Academy schools and had developed a deep admiration for Claude and Gainsborough. By the time he came to paint the Hay Wain, he was fully immersed in the Claudian landscape tradition, freely adapting the countryside he loved to the conventions of the genre.
The actual ordnance survey type topography that you could perhaps depict in an illusory way through photography, has no interest to me. If you said, but where is Blakeney Point and where is the land on the other side of the Wash? I couldn't care less. If I need to move something, I move it. I'm moving about seas of paint. When you're talking about what is it makes Constable great, it certainly isn't topography. People say at Flatford Mill, oh, it's just like that. Of course, it's not like that at all. There's really no case to argue that topography has anything to do with the greatness or the quality of it. In fact, it has a lot to do with the quality, because it's usually abysmal if the pursuit of the painting is something that can be done by other means, recorded by another means, mechanical means better. So topography isn't it. I think Constable was a revolutionary painter, trying to make from very, very humble subjects a sublime art form. But what we like to look at, because we are a rhetorical nation, is a more sentimental, a more nostalgic way of looking at the world. And why the coach trips go on to this day is because Constable has a position almost in the English psyche as representing a golden age, a better time. People don't want to know about the agricultural unrest and about the turmoil that was going on in England in the late 18th and into the early 19th century.
Like Stubbs before him, Constable offered us a vision of rural contentment, an endless summer of reassuring tranquility. Whilst he was painting this picture, he wrote to his fiancée, Maria Bicknell, that he was living wholly in the fields and seeing nothing but harvest men. Painted in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, the subject of the picture, the wheat field itself, had been instrumental in the British victory, but the country was suffering a period of post-war austerity.
A hungry peasant is a potential revolutionary. In the early 19th century, Napoleon decides the way to beat the British, because he can't take them on at sea, his fleets keep getting thrashed, is to close the markets of Europe entirely, to announce an economic blockade, to refuse to allow any British goods into the ports of Europe, and to refuse to allow any of his subject European countries to export anything to Britain. And that motivates the British elite to close ranks. Poets, artists, writers, cartoonists, to come together and portray Britain as a vast larder, bottomless pit of food and happiness and enough for everybody in the country to share. Which is very different to the experience of most working people in 19th century Britain at the time.
Whilst relying on the countryside for inspiration, Constable insulated himself from the reality of rural unrest by immersing himself in his art and in his young family. Constable married Maria in 1816, and they visited Brighton on their honeymoon. They returned to live there in the 1820s, as it was thought the sea air would be beneficial for the health of his wife. His affection for the town was clouded by its new popularity as a resort for fashionable Londoners, a change that was swamping its original character and competing with its fishing industry.
Technically, this is an extraordinary piece of work. For me, as a filmmaker, very noticeable where the light's coming from. But the effect that he has in here as a painter, the effect on the clouds, you know, the light of this piece is very accurate. His feeling about Brighton, he loved it, but he had begun to think of it as London or Piccadilly on the sea, because all these buildings on the Marine Parade had started to be built, and he was sad about it. There's a sense of time changing in it. These people, they don't seem in the same period as the terraces up here. Looking down at Marine Parade, I obviously think of meeting mates on the beach. I lived in Brighton from the age of 2, I guess, until 12. And during the war, a lot of the beach was covered in barbed wire and you couldn't go on it. There was a sense of danger for those young boys. It wasn't scary danger, it was exciting danger. At the time of this picture, his wife was very ill. Brighton was thought of as a spa town at one time. You know, come take the waters at Brighton, the sea and the salt. So that this has a sense of sadness about it. It also probably added to his sense of sadness, the fact that his wife was very ill and they came to the spa, and I don't think it helped that much.
In 1828, Maria died of tuberculosis, leaving Constable with 7 children to raise. But even this tragedy did not lead him to question his vocation as a landscape painter.
Although he could sell things, he was significantly bloody-minded, really, insofar as if he got commissions, he saw these as millstones round his neck, curbing his creativity. So from the artist as the pragmatic journeyman, Constable becomes our ideal of the sort of suffering soul who has great outbursts of personal creativity, which finish up as landscape paintings on canvas.
In the early years of the 19th century, Britain suddenly found herself with 2 powerful but contrasting visions of her landscape. The paintings of John Constable and William Turner were the stars of the Royal Academy shows. But they were as different in temperament as they were in artistic technique.
The difference is really a simple one of Constable being totally immersed in England and Turner being completely immersed in the world, the known world. So in real terms, Constable stayed in England all his life, whereas Turner toured Europe. And if there'd been things such as flight, Turner would have done the world without a doubt.
1819 was Turner's year. He finally made his much-postponed journey to Italy, and the pictures he makes on this trip are the foundation of his reputation. Even after nearly 30 years of anticipation, Italy surpassed his expectations. Painting mainly in watercolour, he worked like a man possessed. It was as if Venice had spent 1,000 years preparing for Turner to show up. He caught perfectly the evanescent light, the heat and shimmer of a vaporous sun gently reflected on the water, and the almost intangible architecture. The techniques he perfected here would reverberate through the rest of his career.
You have a sense in Turner of an expanded worldview. He travelled extensively. His art ranges in its effects and in its styles a great deal. You can see Turner sort of poised between an old world and a modern world in that respect, but being driven at the same time by the ambitions and the commercial enterprise that were very much part and parcel of being an artist in the 19th century.
In 1837, his great rival, John Constable, died. His picturesque landscapes never really lost their appeal. The British art buyer never stopped wanting paintings that stirred emotion, that invited us, like Alice, to step through the glass into the picture. But Turner was just getting into his stride. His late style, an idiosyncratic development of the pictures he made on that first trip to Italy, is still revolutionary today. This picture from 1844 was thought to show a view of Venice, until, being prepared for an exhibition in 2003, it became clear his inspiration was Portsmouth. A year later, he made this picture, Norham Castle, Sunrise.
A lot of the pictures which look most radical, most like Impressionism or Rothko or 20th century abstraction, are actually unfinished pictures which were left in his studio. But the unfinished appearance of these late paintings may not be that unrepresentative of the way he was heading.
Turner died in 1851, proclaiming that the sun is God. His death was an emphatic full stop in a chapter that had seen Britain establish herself at the forefront of landscape painting. Queen Victoria was now on the throne, and Turner's inventiveness was inspiring a new generation to take his ideas in unpredictable directions. If he were looking down from heaven, he was in for a bit of a surprise.
It's very interesting to think what the Victorian public might have thought if confronted by a great late Turner, very much about an impression of light in vapour and then moving swiftly on and seeing the incredible, mind-boggling detail and the garish, strident colours of this Holman Hunt must have been an enormous shock. Well now, here we are. I think we are a little bit below where Hunt was by the looks of it, but where Hunt was, Lover's Seat, seems to have fallen into the sea pretty well. I think what's extraordinary about this painting and Pre-Raphaelite paintings generally is the spirit of inquiry. I mean, Hunt would have been fascinated by the geology of this place and the botany, the flora and the fauna. I very much doubt there's much studio time on this painting. It's all out of doors. He has stood here and let it seep into him. Every inch of the sheep, every meticulous bit of its fur and their faces, and even the sort of the way the light comes through the ears and you can see the blood and cartilage. It's so carefully observed and so directly of nature. The Pre-Raphaelites were all about 18 years old. They were young, they were very young. They formed the Brotherhood in 1848, some 3 or 4 years before Hunt painted this picture. 1848, of course, was the great year of revolution across Europe. We're talking about a revolution not just political, but scientific as well. People were beginning to realize, the fossil record was telling the scientists that the Earth was actually billions of years old, not thousands of years old as the Bible had some Victorians believe. But 1848 was also a very dangerous time politically. And that is one of the meanings that's given to this picture, which, when it was first exhibited, was called Our English Coasts. This was about the vulnerability of Britain to attack from France. Napoleon III had just come to power, and there was a fear that we might have the whole Napoleon thing all over again.
Holman Hunt and his Pre-Raphaelite colleagues remain controversial to this day and tarnished by an association with the perceived moral values of the Victorian age.
Looking at this picture, it's hard to understand why today the word Victorian is still a pejorative and slightly dirty word. The idea that it's a repressive time is simply wrong. The idea that it's a culturally stagnant time is absolutely wrong. It was our visual renaissance, and the Pre-Raphaelites were at the heart of it.
The hyperrealism of the Pre-Raphaelites became the house style in Victorian Britain. In the 1860s, a painter called John Atkinson Grimshaw began to produce romantic twilight depictions of the great northern industrial cities like this scene of his native Leeds. His knack of capturing a particular melancholy moment at dusk struck a chord with the sentimental Victorians, and he set up shop in London, hoping to pull off the same trick in the capital. In 1881, he painted this view of Heath Street in Hampstead.
I'm from round here, which is the joke, arty village of Hampstead, and I know this street very well, or at least I thought I knew it very well. What I didn't realise was that one of my favourite potboiler Victorian artists, Atkinson Grimshaw, had done it. That he'd done, as it appears, that view, which is a raised bit called the Mount. It's all done in the usual Grimshaw way of light, gaslight on water at... It's not dark, but it's dusk and there's a bit of moonlight. All the usual romantic tricks. And then I look up there and it's not the same. And you realise that he's reworked it to make it as dramatic as possible. And when you look down the street, you realise that that perspective's been changed too, because it curves too much. And that's all clever stuff in the composition, which looks very compelling, terribly attractive, and terribly real. Now, the thing that drew me to Atkinson Grimshaw in the first place was the romance of a northern 19th century city, and his great market was a certain kind of northern 19th century industrialist. And I'm none of those things, but it got to me, that particular romance, it got to me even before I'd seen, you know, a 19th century northern city, and then later I lapped them all up. He was a magic weaver, and they were, in a way, a sort of potboiler, a sort of very, very superior potboiler, but by God they work.
Grimshaw had no formal training as a painter, but once he perfected his trademark combination of moonlight and gaslight with a hint of autumnal dampness, he realized it was infinitely adaptable, whatever your subject.
It's what movie makers call the magic hour. It's the last hour of daylight, when the sun has set, but it's not completely dark. It's got a particular magic quality. And then we have the marvellous sky and the light on the river. And it is lovely, and it is very, very evocative. People think something's going to happen.
Something did happen to painting at the time. Impressionism, a style very strongly concerned with the landscape, was turning the art world upside down across the Channel. Monet even came to London to show us how to do it. But it didn't go down very well over here. We were still in a pre-Raphaelite mood. The first signs of a British avant-garde finally began to emerge in the first years of the 20th century. The Camden Town Group, named for the area where they met, depicted a serene and tranquil urban landscape, celebrating the mundane, deserting realism for the strident palette of post-impressionism. They were inspired by a vision of a new Britain being built at the time.
Ebenezer Howard, the pioneer of garden cities, built Letchworth with tree-lined roads and a town centre, the first complete new town where people could live as well as work in pleasant surroundings.
The admiration which these new towns evoked is unmistakable in this view of Letchworth by Spencer Gore.
This was absolute utopia. The suburbs were the brave new world. People say, you know, that the Camden Town Group found delight in the mundane, but this wasn't mundane. Absolutely not. This was totally and utterly aspirational. In the same way that living in a loft apartment for a city dweller now might be seen as aspirational. I mean, when you look at southern middle-class Letchworth, it looks beautiful, and it was seen as a wonderfully spacious place to move to. It's still classed by many as a dream. I mean, you've got to imagine that, you know, people have been living in a city that's got back-to-back housing, and then suddenly you can live in housing like that. Well, who wouldn't want to? This is still classed by many as a wonderful place to live.
The philanthropist Dame Henrietta Barnett, who built Hampstead Garden Suburb, hoped to create a community of helpful neighbours, where from every part there shall be good views or glimpses of distant country.
I grew up in the Hampstead Garden Suburb with a father who was an academic who specialised in urban planning and who was involved in the Garden City movement himself and the planning of the Green Belt. So I grew up with people who were theoreticians of garden suburbs in a garden suburb. That'll do things to a child.
Dame Henrietta's goal was a socially diverse community with homes for all income levels. It would offer working people the opportunity of taking a cottage with a garden within a twopenny fare of central London. William Ratcliffe, a founder member of the Camden Town Group, was an enthusiastic resident.
I mean, there were other kind of utopian aspects to this, if not exactly socialist, at any rate socialistic, such as there being kind of no pubs. We've got to remember the importance of the temperance movement at the end of the 19th century, and no shops, no commercial activity at all. By the Second World War, if not before, that dream of a socially mixed community had completely gone. You know, and you've got to bear in mind, these houses, even these modest artisans' houses, are now probably $1 million a pop. I grew up beyond the North Circular in the kind of annex of the Hampstead Garden Suburbs. So to me, and this is what I find so enjoyable and evocative about this painting and being here again, to me this area was a kind of you know, bourgeois Valhalla or kind of Elysian field, being slightly plusher than we were. So I think that's all captured rather well. It looks like the kind of middle-class city on the hill. It's infused with a kind of honeyed conception of what suburban living might be like. This view is a kind of impossibilist view, painted from about 40 feet up from a tower that was attached to the kind of clubhouse, the suburban clubhouse. That must have been a fun venue that William Ratcliffe stood on to get this view of, I suppose, the future of a kind of rationally and beautifully planned urban scape. And perhaps it's somewhat ironic that the tower was bombed in the Second War and that this view isn't really possible anymore.
Another urban scene that has all but disappeared today was being painted by a young student at the Salford School of Art in the 1920s. L.S. Lowry's pictures of the dark satanic mills of his hometown were a powerfully authentic vision of a vanishing way of life.
Lowry was always seen in the 60s and 70s as something rather quaint and outre and northern. There are elements of Lowry which are, first of all, the social documents. I was looking at some old films on the cotton towns made in the 50s and 60s about the end of the cotton industry in Lancashire. And they were extraordinarily accurate paintings in feeling, not the topography, that Lowry had conjured up. He was a very sophisticated artist. It is not primitive matchstick men in quaint little hovels that the workers are all living in. It was a very, very subtle and sophisticated sensibility.
Lowry was a contradictory figure. His idiosyncratic works sold well throughout his career, but he never gave up his job as a rent collector, retiring on his 65th birthday. His effective simplification of the urban landscape went hand in hand with the love of the photorealism of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood.
I suppose being a northerner, Lowry has always resonated. This particular one was on my nan's wall. You know, when I go running along a canal in a town like Burnley or somewhere, and you go and you see buildings like this that are still unrenovated, there's this thing of beauty, of opportunity, and of almost sadness of where you see an industrial town that's fallen on more difficult times. This was a new urban landscape, and some people looked on this and you know, may think, oh, was Lowry painting something that was a little bit depressing and capturing something that wasn't very human? But actually this is capturing something that's very human indeed. It's people going to work, earning a living. They've all got a spring in their step because it was pretty exciting having a job, number one. It's a completely celebratory landscape to me. Now it can almost look as quaint as seeing the rural idyll with a horse, you know, with its cart and hay next to a water wheel, you know, because obviously that's gone with mechanisation. This has gone to China.
Another unlikely teenage fan of the pre-Raphaelites was Paul Nash. A Londoner from a comfortable middle-class family, the First World War had brought an abrupt end to his studies. Working as an official war artist, he survived the trenches and emerged having forged his own unique style and achieved national recognition. He managed to combine an enthusiasm for modernism with a love of the countryside and a dark, romantic and mystical notion of Britain's ancient past. He painted this chalk cross cut into a Chiltern hillside in 1931. The fact that nothing is known about its creation or purpose was just the sort of thing that appealed to Nash.
Nash would have been fascinated by this attempt to slightly reorder the natural world. I mean, what we're looking at here is evidence of human beings' early attempts at landscape art. I noticed absolutely immediately that the cliff up there is slightly curved, whereas Nash has gone absolutely out of his way to make it as sharp-edged as possible, which gives an artificiality to his painting, and it's an attempt by him to distance himself from the empirical reality by turning up the unease and the edginess within his painting.
Nash's physical frailty bred in him a preoccupation with mortality. Convalescing in Oxford after an asthma attack that nearly killed him, he painted the view looking across the flat landscape towards a pair of squat hills surmounted by ancient groves of trees that had become iconic in his work, the Wittenham Clumps.
Well, this is the landscape of the vernal equinox, painted using binoculars to see a view that he wasn't any longer able to get to. The extraordinary and very effective consequence of that technique is this flattening of the picture plane, so that things that are actually really were quite close to the artist appear almost on the same plane as the hills that were 15 miles away. I was fortunate enough to grow up about 10 miles away from here, and I used to come up here on a very regular basis because it's just such a special place. At the age of about 10 or 12, I started to be aware of the paintings of Paul Nash and his association with this area. And evermore, this landscape with the two hills and the trees on the tops of the hills have been very special to me. He had an extraordinary ability to bring together and create his own visual language. He was a modernist, but a mystic. He could reconcile abstraction and surrealism, and he was the most international of artists, producing the most English of pictures.
Landscape of the Vernal Equinox was bought by the Queen Mother while the paint was still wet, prompting her daughter, Princess Margaret, to declare, "Poor Mummy's gone mad. Look what she's brought back."
Now, the vernal equinox is that point in the spring when the hours of daylight and the hours of nighttime are exactly equal. The painting is divided into these two facets, these two basic halves. On the right-hand side, we have elements representing rationality, and the left-hand side is the mystical side. It's interesting to talk about this picture in this sort of analytical kind of way, but it's also very dangerous, because what I thoroughly enjoy about this painting is some strange mystical realm that it creates, which defies easy rational explanation. It puts these elements in before you, and then it's up to you to make of them what you can.
Paul Nash was of that unlucky generation who were of an age to serve in both world wars. Once again being called up in 1939. This time he was attached to the Air Ministry and painted this picture, Battle of Britain, in the dark days of 1941, when positive war news was in short supply and the achievements of the few represented, as Nash said, our great aerial victory over Germany.
A sky with a battle in it is quite a strange idea. It really does take me back to cycling up to the Downs and seeing a dogfight of these airplanes. I might easily have seen this battle, this moment of air warfare. I could have easily been here. Maybe I was. A couple of times I saw one break away and leaving its vapor trail, go spiraling down, bang into the sea. It's over very quickly too. That's the curious thing. I mean, that's something that is quite true. The vapor trails stay, but the actual battle lasts minutes, a few minutes.
For Nash, this was more than a realistic portrayal of the events of the dogfight. He wanted to highlight the cultural freedoms for which he felt we were fighting. The defending Spitfires rise from the warm, earthy foreground, in contrast to the regimental order of the approaching German bombers, who were broken up into the surreal, swirling forms of the lingering vapor trails.
The power of it is in the power is in that section of it, that section of the sky littered with a battle. It was real, but amazing. It's terrible to say a beautiful painting, but it's an extraordinary impression. He's caught the sense of it. I think he's caught the sense of it marvelously.
Whilst war artists were felt to stir our patriotic sensibilities in an intangible way, there was also a more direct appeal for the war effort. The talents of commercial poster artists and powerful images of the British landscape were combined to spur us on to victory. The most enduring of these was a series painted by a prolific draftsman from Bradford, Frank Newbold. Your Britain, fight for it now.
In the Second World War, we see exactly what we see in the Napoleonic period, but rather than Turner and Constable, we have the patriotic posters, Your Britain, fight for it now. The desperate attempt to use the British landscape to motivate people, whether they be in shell factories or fighting in the Western Desert against the Germans, to mobilise themselves to protect this vision of Britain from foreign aggression. If you love the South Downs, go and kill Germans. And what struck me as so strange about the use of bucolic imagery in the Second World War propaganda is that most of the soldiers are teenage kids from urban Glasgow, Manchester, Liverpool. They've never been to the South Downs, and yet there's something embedded, apparently, in the British character that responds to those images of landscape.
Newbold's travel posters were strikingly effective at capturing a scene in simple blocks of bold colour, like this view of Bridlington. Today, the resort is home to David Hockney. Bigger Trees Near Water, painted in the surrounding Yorkshire wolds, is made of 50 separate canvases, measuring 40 feet across.
Seen in the context of landscape painting history, it's probably the largest painting ever painted entirely outside. He used digital photography to keep track all the time of what he was doing so that he could relate each painting as he was painting it to the ones on either side.
I'm interested in picture making technology, is really what I'm keen on, and react to it quickly. I began drawing on an iPhone, and you began as a novelty, and it's a great drawing instrument, marvellous range of marks if you get into it. It's just something in your pocket. You can always bring it out and do a little sketch. There's no mess. No, you don't need a glass of water. You don't have to clean up. The other great new thing in it is the distribution of the image. That is profoundly new. I could make a drawing of the sunrise at 6 a.m. and at 7 a.m. send it out to 20 people. If I'd just had a pencil and paper by my bedside, the sunrise wouldn't be that interesting.
I suppose one of the magic things about them is that drawing as it exists on my iPhone is pretty well precisely the same as on his iPhone, so you could say it's the original, or you could say it undermines the whole idea of an original work of art.
But whatever route technology takes us down in the future, the fundamental issues of representing our landscape as art haven't changed much since Richard Wilson painted Holt Bridge.
I've had a go reconstructing Wilson's view, and he really has exaggerated the elements. The key motifs are there, but the rocky outcrop is so much smaller in reality. So I've had to scale it up, probably 10, 15-fold. It's just more grandiose, I think, in his interpretation. What Landscape artists like Richard Wilson and Claude Lorraine are trying to do capture this Arcadian beautiful landscape, that perfect summer afternoon that looks as if it has existed forever. And that's when an artist is at its best, when he makes that perfect moment for us that we could never see in reality.
British landscape painting has come a long way in 4 centuries, from disdain to deep respect, and we cherish these images as we cherish the landscape that inspired them.
Artists bring an agenda to the picture, and they bring themselves, and they bring their history, and they bring their hopes and fears, and that's what either makes the painting very, very interesting or not. My paintings that we've got the show opening here tonight are pretty transparently about an age of uncertainty. It's pretty overt that they're not the paintings of a period when people are at peace with themselves, particularly. They're paintings of the earth disappearing underneath houses and trees and wartime structures.
You know, landscape art will always represent the way that people live. It always has done so. You know, we'll continue to paint the countryside, we'll continue to paint the city, we'll continue to paint the suburb. It's a way of commenting on the lives that we lead.
Artists spend all their time stating aims. It's only the objects that come through. Constable had all these aims, Turner had all these aims, but you're left with an object. The object is so much more important than the person making the object. The only aims that are of any interest to us are the aims on the canvases, which are to do with the landscape.